Hey there. So this morning, well, it is bright and early, 4:15 a.m. for me, and so if my voice seems low, this is why. I'm just trying not to disturb others. But this morning I wanted to discuss olfaction, scent, and I wanted to talk about its potential utility in your practice in the craft, give you some background on olfaction, and in general just talk about some ideas that I find interesting, all in the hopes of convincing you that the use of scent can be really advantageous, that you can really leverage it in order to get interesting effects. So a little heads up before I get started. This video is going to be purely of this image that you see on the screen now, so do feel free to pop in your headset, do the dishes, do the laundry, wander around. You're not going to miss anything by not staring at the screen. Now, the use of scent has a rich history in spirituality, in religious ceremony, particularly in the use of incense. That has been a feature of religious practices for a very long time, and it's something that has been incorporated probably by the majority of people practicing witchcraft. Many of you guys watching probably have an incense burner on your altar space, oftentimes as a representative of the element of air. Those of you who meditate likely burn some incense while you do so. Oh, by the way, if you hear hissing in the background, those are just my heaters. Pay them no mind. And yet, despite that, a lot of us have incorporated these aspects into our work. And although we may think deeply about the significance of incense or smoke in an elemental context, we haven't necessarily spent a great deal of time thinking about just what we're doing from a psychological or neural processing standpoint. Like perhaps a lot of things in our practice, we do it because it works, and precisely how it works, well, may matter less or may be less clear. But what I'm hoping to do today is offer some information that may help clarify exactly what's going on, may give you some new ideas as to how smell, the use of incense, that sort of thing, is having an impact in your work, and perhaps even how you can expand its influence and get more bang for your buck. I think that in the general consciousness, there are two essentially conflicting ideas about scent. The first is that smell is deeply tied to emotion, that it can be a very potent aspect of memory. This idea that flashbulb memories, really intense emotional experiences, are closely tied to scent. And yet, on the other hand, there's also this idea that humans don't really rely on scent. Smell isn't something that's particularly important to us from a sensory modality standpoint, that we can, by and large, get through our day without ever really thinking about smell. And that second viewpoint, that scent isn't all that important to people, really dates back to the late 19th century. This idea that humans are microsmatic, which is to say, not very good at detecting or processing or identifying scent. Well, that idea really planted itself in a substantial way in the public consciousness following the anatomical studies of a gentleman named Pierre-Paul Broca, who took it upon himself to compare olfactory bulb size across various species. Now, the olfactory bulbs are basically the first neuroanatomical stop on the smell processing chain. In humans, there are a pair of 1.5-inch long elongated teardrops attached right at the base of the brain, on the underside of what you would picture when you picture a brain. And what Broca found was that relative to other species that we do think of as being particularly osmotic, reliant on a sense of smell, humans have very small olfactory bulbs, and that the amount of neural real estate taken up by those bulbs shrinks as you climb the phylogenetic tree. And so, of course, this idea that obviously if the brain processing regions that are primarily involved in teasing apart this sensory modality are very small, they probably don't matter that much. And that work was supported in many ways over the ensuing centuries, including more anatomical studies, for instance, demonstrating that in primates, the size of the olfactory bulb scales negatively with expansion of the neocortex, which is to say that the bigger our neocortex, the smaller our olfactory bulbs and our secondary olfactory processing regions are. And in general, among primates, there was this move away from relying on scent as a means of interacting and understanding one's environment towards the use of vision. And again, I don't think that would come as a surprise to anyone. I think we instinctually think, yes, we are very visual creatures. We are auditory creatures. We rely on these modalities in order to interact with our environment a great deal more than we rely on scent. And in fact, this evolutionary move towards trichromatic vision, which is to say color vision that uses 3 colors to create the visual palette, is associated with an increase in the number of olfactory receptor genes that are no longer in active use. And so for a very long time, there was a very strong scientific argument to be made that olfaction simply didn't really matter for people. And we can carry that over to stuff like pheromones, whose processing in other species is dependent upon something called the vomeronasal organ, which in humans is generally accepted to be vestigial. And yet, despite all of this neuroanatomical data that was collected, supporting the idea that humans simply don't really need scent, rely on scent, there was all sorts of undeniably interesting psychological and experiential data suggesting that, well, hey, in some cases, smell really does seem to be a factor. And in the past 15 years or so, we've really done a lot of good work trying to tease apart how people really do interact with odor. And that experiential data, those anecdotal experiences that people have regarding strong memories associated strongly with scent, those represent the other side of the coin, that other popular conception that people have, that smell is somehow deeply tied to emotion. And that's not wrong. Olfaction is quite preferentially processed in humans in emotional areas. It conveys emotional information. And although it may not be the primary sensory modality with which we interact with the world on a day-to-day basis, like if I bring you into a new room, you're likely to look around, develop a sense of that room based on visual cues rather than olfactory cues, unless there is a very strong and striking olfactory experience going hand in hand with that. Whereas regardless of how weird visually the room is, you're going to take in that visual information. Despite this reliance on visual information to navigate the world, we are nevertheless processing olfaction and tying it preferentially to emotional experience. And so in a very general sense, you can think of olfaction, your sense of smell, as having become a specialist instead of a generalist. It is primarily interested in tying the olfactory environment to emotional response and emotional processing. And this seems to be particularly true when we're talking about trauma, where olfactory information is often part of that really intense emotional memory, and in which case that olfactory experience, if re-experienced, can trigger a very vivid reliving of that trauma. And so, for instance, let's say you're a soldier who's recently returned from deployment. The smell of burning rubber may be sufficient to elicit a very intense, visceral emotional response, one that very closely mirrors the sort of emotional experience you would have had in the war. But there's another side, another reason for why people don't necessarily think of the sense of smell as being particularly prominent in their day-to-day lives, and which contributed to this idea that people are microsmatic. And that's that the vast majority of the olfactory processing that does go on is unconscious. And being unconscious, it's very easy to think it's not happening at all. We're not aware of most of the olfactory cues that we experience. But as many of you watching are no doubt aware, you don't have to be consciously aware of something in order to be affected by it. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, great, but what's the point of me telling you all of this? Well, it's to highlight the potential of olfaction, of using your sense of smell to help elicit particular psychological and emotional states. And there are a few ways you can do this. The first is one a lot of you have probably engaged in instinctually, which is picking incense based on what scents speak to you. So you may go to a shop, you may smell different kinds of incense, and you make your selection based on what you like. Now, because you're witches, you're probably also taking correspondences and things like that into account. But in general, you're selecting and dismissing blends, scents, based on aesthetics, as it were. And your particular tastes when it comes to incense, the source of those tastes can basically be broken down into two areas. One is essentially dependent on the fact that we all share fundamentally similar tastes when it comes to things like scent. There was an evolutionary drive towards appreciating scents that were associated with positive outcomes. Just like most of us enjoy sweet things, most of us enjoy the smell of vanilla. And this goes into your selection of scents to use and is also reflected in what scents get used popularly. So again, vanilla, very common component in perfume. The other major source of your decision is based on personal experience, personal associations that have formed with particular scents. Now, in many cases, you may not be aware of these associations, and even thinking back in the hopes of identifying their genesis is likely not to work. Although in some cases you may get lucky and remember that your grandmother, whom you lost young but really adore, you always happen to visit her in mid-June when the lilacs were in bloom, and while you don't remember the scent of lilacs in the context of any of those memories, you now almost have a lilac fetish, and perhaps that's the source. But regardless, your personal experiences have helped dictate your olfactory preferences. And so that's another major influence when selecting scents. And that's also a great reason to select particular scents. You are effectively leveraging your already existing emotional response to a smell in order to help re-evoke that response in ritual. But what that also means is that that scent is already a hook upon which you've hung an emotional experience, a particular state. And rededicating that hook to a new experience becomes quite challenging. That scent is spoken for from an emotional, psychological, historical standpoint. And to create new experiences, new associations with states and emotions and contexts that you'd like to explore, you are best served by finding yourself in senses that do not evoke strong positive feelings right off the bat. Scents that are not popular, are not instinctively adored by most people, because like most cues in associative learning, the specificity of that cue, the rarity of that cue will facilitate your capacity to associate it with a particular state, particular experience, with specific information. You may really love the scent of vanilla, but because everybody else does, if, for instance, vanilla is the scent you burn every time you try and enter a trance state, well, the association between the scent of vanilla and trance state is going to be weaker. That vanilla is not going to be as effective in inducing that state because, one, you have a long history of prior associations with vanilla, and two, you run into that scent constantly from day to day. In the elevator when the admin assistant from your office walks in, she wears vanilla in her perfume. Anytime you walk into a bakery, frequently when you get into a cab. And that wide exposure essentially serves to lessen the impact of that scent on you. What you're looking for really is a scent that is dedicated to one purpose and which will only ever be encountered in that context. And if you can do that, then by pairing the use of that scent with, let's say, only astral travel, after a few experiences, simply experiencing that scent will facilitate your transfer to the astral. Incidentally, I think this also represents one of the reasons that the use of weird herbs in witchcraft is so popular and so beneficial. These are plants that are really only experienced in particular contexts. 99.9% of the population has no cause or call to burn wormwood. And so by engaging in the use of those herbs and the scents produced from those herbs in a ritual context, we are really building a strong foundation upon which we can hang new associations, upon which we can help us reach particular psychological and emotional states. All of which is to say that I think we are all well served by expanding our olfactory repertoire, by seeking out new scents that aren't reflexively incredibly positive or incredibly negative. Now, of course, when you're talking about incense, most of the incense that gets sold is going to be stuff that smells good to most people, or else they probably wouldn't make it. They wouldn't make a lot of money selling it. So if your local shop doesn't sell a large selection of pre-made incenses, this is the point where you want to start looking into smoldering your own herbs and being able to go out and find your own herbs, make your own blends. Keeping in mind you, that the emotional associations that we attribute to an individual herb in a blend is going to be transferred to other herbs in that blend. Basically, from a processing standpoint, we group together things that we experience in common. So if you have pre-existing strong associations with the scent of sage, for instance, and you mix it with novel herbs that you haven't experienced before in the hopes of creating an incense that will be particular to entering a trance state, well, the addition of that sage is going to carry over the same kinds of associations, and you will have lessened the impact of those novel herbs that you're using. So just a little warning there. This is getting pretty long. I think I might have to call it quits at this point. I knew this would last way longer than I wanted. Okay, so what I will do instead is next time talk about a different facet of olfaction, including for you people who work in covens, interesting aspects of olfactory processing that are very potent and can really be used in order to help a group coalesce and enter the same state of mind. So, as always, thank you so much for stopping by. I do hope you found this interesting. I am perhaps a little more enthusiastic about this topic than most people, but that's fine. And of course, if there was anything I wasn't clear about or which you would like for me to expand upon on the next video, just let me know. I will endeavor to do my best. And otherwise, thank you again for swinging by, and I hope you have a wonderful day.